At first glance, Silverpine was the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. A frozen river glistened under the winter sun. Shops shuttered early, smoke curling from chimneys. Strangers rarely passed through. Yet that December, one SUV pulled into town carrying 3 lives and one dangerous secret. Verena Cross was calm, elegant, and precise. She played the part of guardian well, but her smile was brittle, her hands too controlling. In the wheelchair sat Leora, a fragile girl who spoke little but whose eyes told a different story. Beside her was Marin, sharp, restless, always watching. When Sheriff Elias Ward met them on the trail, it was Brutus, the German shepherd at his side, who noticed first. The dog stiffened, his growl low and dangerous. It was a warning no one else could hear. What followed would unravel lies buried under years of control, reveal a betrayal so cruel it left scars deeper than snowdrifts, and prove once more that the bond between a man and his dog can cut through even the darkest of deceptions. This is their story, and once you hear it, you won't forget it. The road into Silverpine wound like a frozen vein through the mountains, each bend revealing another sweep of cedar trees, bowed under the weight of snow. The battered SUV crawled forward, its tires crunching over gravel and ice patches, headlights throwing pale cones of light into the curtain of falling flurries. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth with a tired rhythm, squeaking faintly, as if even they were reluctant to enter this forgotten valley. Behind the wheel sat Verena Cross, her posture flawless despite the long drive. Not a wrinkle marred her beige wool coat, not a strand of chestnut hair strayed from the braid resting neatly over her shoulder. Her face was pale, angular, almost elegant, but the kind of elegance sharpened by calculation. She drove without speaking, her gloved hands fixed at 10 and 2, eyes locked forward. Silence clung to her, like another layer of clothing. The SUV turned onto a narrow track lined with skeletal trees. At its end, a small cabin hunched at the edge of the woods, roof sagging under snow, porch listing with age. One window flickered dimly, reflecting the grey light of afternoon. A rocking chair on the porch shifted faintly with the wind, though the air had stilled. When the engine cut off, silence roared. No bird song, no distant traffic, only the faint creak of the pines. Verena opened her door with a crisp motion, stepping into the cold. She inhaled sharply, not because the air was clean, but because it was hers now. This cabin, this town, these children. The passenger door opened slower. Leora, only 9 years old, sat in her wheelchair, her scarf wrapped tightly around her thin neck, hands resting on a stuffed rabbit with a missing button eye. Her dark eyes carried a dim light, not lifeless, but weighed down, as if too much had been taken from her already. She didn't move until Verena unfolded the wheelchair and gestured sharply. "Come on," Verena said, not unkindly, but without warmth. Her voice was always measured, like a teacher correcting a class, never bending, never breaking. Marin, Leora's twin, burst from the other side of the SUV with a restless energy. Her cheeks reddened from the cold as she slammed the door harder than necessary. Unlike her sister, Marin's eyes darted everywhere, sharp and suspicious, taking in the cabin, the trees, the sagging porch. She narrowed her gaze at the rocking chair and muttered under her breath, "This place looks like it eats kids for breakfast." Verena ignored her. She lifted Leora from the seat, her grip efficient but not affectionate, and lowered her into the chair. Leora did not flinch, did not sigh. She had long stopped reacting to the hands that carried her. Her scarf fluttered briefly in the wind, before she tucked it back into her lap. Snow crunched under their boots and wheels as they approached the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted their presence. The rocking chair creaked again, though no wind stirred. Maren lagged behind, her boots skidding in the snow, eyes darting to the tree line where shadows tangled among the branches. She glanced back at her sister, then up at Verena, who was fumbling with the keys at the door. Something in Maren's gut tightened, something old and instinctive. She whispered, barely audible, "We shouldn't be here." Leora heard, but said nothing. She never spoke first anymore. The door opened with a groan, stale air wafting out, a mix of dust, mildew, and something metallic, faint but sharp. Verena stepped inside without hesitation, heels clicking on the wooden floor. Leora's wheelchair bumped over the threshold, wheels squeaking faintly, while Maren hovered just behind, reluctant. Inside, the cabin greeted them with a silence that wasn't peace, but absence. Dust coated the mantel over a stone fireplace. Curtains hung limp, yellowed with age. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed. Verena set her bag down on the table and surveyed the room like a queen inspecting her throne. "It will do," she murmured. The girls said nothing. Leora's rabbit slid slightly in her lap, one frayed ear drooping. Maren crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She could feel the cold pressing in even here, as though the walls weren't meant to keep warmth inside. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching long and thin across the porch. The rocking chair moved again. From the woods, unseen, a single crow took flight, its wings scattering snow from a cedar branch. Its cry echoed briefly before fading into the stillness. And in that stillness, 3 lives stepped into a story that Silverpine would never let sink quietly into its soil. The door shut with a dull thud, muffling the outside world and locking the 3 of them into the stale air of the cabin. For a long moment, there was no movement, only the faint ticking of a wall clock that had long ago stopped keeping time. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shaft of light from the half-drawn curtains, each speck a fragment of years that had settled here, untouched. Verena set her leather satchel on the wooden table with a sharp, deliberate motion. "Coats off." "Boots by the door," she instructed, her tone clipped, not raised, but carrying the weight of a command that did not invite delay. She began pulling off her gloves, folding them with neat precision, placing them atop the bag as though order itself were her shield. Maren kicked at the floorboards with her boot instead of removing it, muttering, "Smells like old mushrooms in here." The sarcasm slipped out like a spark from flint, a small rebellion that barely broke the silence. Verena's eyes cut toward her, cold and warning, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence after her glance was heavier than words, and Maren dropped her gaze, yanking off her boots with exaggerated force and tossing them aside. Meanwhile, Leora sat quietly in her wheelchair near the doorway, scarf still wound around her neck. She held her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest, her fingers absently tracing the missing button eye. The wheels of her chair squeaked faintly as Verena maneuvered her toward the corner of the room, as though the child were another piece of furniture to be placed where it wouldn't be in the way. "The upstairs bedroom is mine. You two take the one at the back," Verena said, already moving toward the narrow staircase. "Unpack what you can. Dinner in an hour." Her voice was efficient, stripped of warmth. There was no welcome, no attempt to make the cabin feel like a home. It was logistics, like she was arranging baggage, not lives. Maren dragged the suitcase toward the small hallway, grumbling under her breath. Feels like we're moving into a coffin. She didn't look at Leora when she said it, but her twin's silence was enough. The back room was cramped, 2 narrow beds separated by a nightstand with a broken lamp. The wallpaper peeled in strips, and the faint odor of mildew clung to the corners like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out. Maren tossed her bag onto the bed nearest the window and flopped down, staring at the cracked ceiling. Leora's chair squeaked as Maren helped maneuver her inside. She positioned herself by the wall, near the bed with the sagging mattress. Her eyes wandered across the room, but lingered on nothing. When she finally whispered, her voice was barely audible. "It's fine." "No, it's not," Maren shot back, her voice hushed but edged with anger. "It's gross. And she acts like this is some family vacation." From the other room, the clatter of pans echoed faintly as Verena rummaged through the cupboards. The sound was mechanical, rhythmic, without the gentle chaos of real cooking. When dinner came, it was boiled pasta with no sauce, just butter melted in uneven patches, and apple slices laid in rigid rows on the plates. "Eat," Verena said simply, setting the dishes down without looking at them or at the girls. She poured herself tea, sitting straight at the head of the table, scrolling on her phone with her free hand. The clink of forks was the only sound for several minutes. Leora took small bites, her face neutral. Maren stabbed the pasta as though each piece were an enemy, muttering something about cardboard food that she knew Verena wouldn't hear, or wouldn't care to. Meals should have been moments of conversation, of laughter, of stories told around steam and spice. Here, it was just another task. The silence was not comforting. It was a silence that pressed down, demanding obedience. When Verena's phone rang, the thin air in the room shifted. She rose from the table, voice softening unnaturally as she answered, "Yes, it's handled. The paperwork is secure. Don't worry." Her back turned, her tone syrupy and precise, but threaded with calculation. Maren leaned closer across the table, whispering, "She's lying to someone." Leora's eyes flicked toward the doorway, where Verena's figure stood rigid in the dim hall light. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, her lips parting just slightly. It was the closest she came to agreement. They whispered in fragments, 2 small voices finding courage in each other. "She talks like it's all business. She doesn't care about us. She never did." When Verena re-entered the room, her smile was too smooth, the kind of expression practiced in mirrors. She sat again, reclaiming silence like it was her rightful throne. After dinner, she gave more clipped instructions. Unpack properly, clothes folded, no clutter. She turned back to her phone, thumbs moving in restless bursts of typing and deleting, the screen casting a cold glow across her pale face. Upstairs, the floor creaked as she moved about. The sisters stayed awake longer than they should have, whispering in the back room under thin blankets. The cabin groaned with the weight of winter, the old timbers shifting. But it wasn't the house that made their whispers urgent. It was the knowledge that every creak could be her footsteps. Every silence could hide her listening. And so, long after Verena's phone calls had ceased, and her door upstairs had closed, 2 girls lay awake in the dark, one clutching a stuffed rabbit, the other staring at the ceiling, both bound together by the kind of unease that only deepens when no one else is watching. Morning settled over Silverpine like a shroud of glass, fragile and cold. The town rested in the crook of the highlands, pressed against the ribs of two mountain ridges where cedar trees stood like sentinels, their branches bent low under weeks of snow. From above, Silverpine looked less like a community and more like an afterthought, a scattering of rooftops along the frozen gleam of the Garnet River, each chimney sending thin ribbons of smoke into the white-grey sky. The river itself was mostly locked in ice, only a narrow vein of water visible near the center, flowing sluggishly as though it hesitated to stay alive in such a season. Children once skated here in winters long past. Their laughter, it was said, still lingered faintly on the wind. Now the only sound was the crackle of shifting ice, a low groan that carried across the valley like an old warning. Silverpine's main street stretched short and straight, its cobblestones buried beneath salted slush. Shops lined both sides, timber facades with faded paint and wooden signs dulled by frost. The bakery, once the heart of morning life, kept its shutters half closed now, the scent of bread faint compared to years before. The hardware store leaned with age, its windows covered in flyers from past season's festivals, each one curling at the edges, unread by most. The general store was open but dim, one yellow bulb swinging above shelves lined with staples, flour, kerosene, canned peaches. Customers came rarely and left quickly, their boots tapping fast rhythms on the floorboards, as if reluctant to linger. There was no rush here, but no vitality either. Life in Silverpine moved like the snow itself, slow, muffled, almost hesitant. People passed one another with nods more than words, their eyes carrying stories they had no interest in telling. Paths wound away from town, threading through the cedar groves. In daylight, those trails looked ordinary. Branches heavy with snow, animal tracks pressed deep in the powder. But locals knew better. Stories hung there too, whispered tales of men who drank too much and never returned, children who followed fox tracks too far, and memories of accidents spoken about only behind closed doors. Stories sink into the soil, old men said at the barber shop, and rarely resurface. The phrase had become a kind of folklore, repeated so often that it had sharpened into truth. What Silverpine buried, it intended to keep buried. The church stood at the far end of town, its white steeple poking through fog like a bone. Once, bells rang there every Sunday morning, summoning families wrapped in scarves and mittens. But the bells had gone silent years ago, ever since Pastor Green's sudden passing. The town never found another willing to replace him. The steeple remained, a hollow finger pointing upward, unanswered. At the edge of Silverpine lay the remnants of its abandoned sawmill. The long roof sagged in the middle, rust creeping along its tin spine. Icicles hung from its beams like teeth. Few dared wander there, not because it was unsafe, but because the air itself seemed haunted by industry left unfinished. One could almost hear the echo of saw blades spinning, the bark of foremen, the crash of logs rolling. It was a place where silence had settled too quickly, as if covering something best left unsaid. The townspeople had grown used to these ghosts. They carried on with their days clearing sidewalks, shoveling roofs, chopping wood. They nodded to Elias Ward, their sheriff, when he walked the streets with Brutus, grateful for his presence, but careful never to ask about the years he had spent away. In Silverpine, questions were rarely exchanged. The snow amplified this culture of silence. It softened every step, muted every sound, made even laughter seem subdued. The blanket of white was deceptive. It looked pure, cleansing, yet it held secrets beneath, covering broken branches, tracks, and sometimes things far worse. On the far side of the river, a narrow bridge arched toward the forest cabins. Its planks groaned under any weight, echoing against the ice below. This was the road Verena Cross had taken the night before, her SUV grumbling across its length, carrying 2 children into the folds of a town that did not ask questions, even when questions should have been asked. Silverpine did not watch arrivals. It observed in silence, the way cedar trees observed storms, waiting, listening, holding its breath. It was not a town that welcomed or rejected. It simply absorbed, as it always had, letting each new story seep into its soil until no one could remember where it began. And so, as Verena and the twins unpacked their bags in the dim cabin on the ridge, Silverpine continued in its muted rhythm. The butcher swept his porch. The postmaster locked the door earlier than usual. Miriam Hale at the veterinary clinic fed a recovering spaniel and stared absently out the frosted window. Elias Ward walked his route, Brutus padding silent and steady at his side, their footprints the only fresh marks on the street. The town did not yet know what had arrived at its doorstep. It did not know the weight Verena carried in her satchel, nor the burden on Leora's small shoulders, nor the defiance building in Maren's gaze. But Silverpine had a way of drawing truth out slowly, like sap from a tree. Thick, reluctant, impossible to stop once it began. For now, the snow lay quiet, softening every rooftop and muffling every sound, hiding the unease that lurked beneath. The river groaned, the cedars swayed. The rocking chair on the cabin porch creaked with no wind to push it. Silverpine, with all its quiet streets and cedar-lined paths, was the kind of place where secrets could linger for years without notice, until someone finally dared to listen. The morning light in Silverpine never arrived in full. It seeped through the clouds in a dim wash, painting everything in shades of grey and silver. Frost clung to the edges of window panes, to the thin wires that sagged between poles, to the cedar boughs heavy with their own silence. It was the kind of light that made the town look like it was carved out of ash and bone. On mornings like this, Sheriff Elias Ward walked the streets. Not because crime demanded it. Silverpine rarely mustered more than a scuffle outside the tavern or a lost hiker to retrieve, but because routine was the last thread keeping him anchored. His boots crunched softly against the frozen earth, his patrol coat buttoned high at the collar. He moved with the kind of steadiness that belonged to men who had carried weight most of their lives, his broad shoulders set in a way that made strangers straighten their spines without knowing why. At his side padded Brutus, the German shepherd, who had once been the town's pride in service. Age showed only in the grey dusting his muzzle, not in his stride. His coat was thick, sable streaked with tan, gleaming even under the dull winter sky. A long scar curved across his right shoulder, a souvenir from a house fire 2 years prior, when he had dragged a boy out seconds before the floor collapsed. The wound had healed, but the story lingered in every cautious movement, in every flick of his tail when he heard distant crackling wood. Brutus walked a half-step ahead, nose lifting, ears twitching with a focus that never dulled, not even in retirement. His amber eyes scanned the streets with a vigilance sharper than any deputy's. People in Silverpine had learned to trust those eyes more than words. If Brutus relaxed, they relaxed. If he stiffened, they locked their doors. Elias let the leash hang loose between them, though he rarely needed it. Their rhythm had been carved into muscle memory years ago. One glance, one pause, one sound, and the other understood. They were 2 figures, bound by quiet history, a soldier and his sentinel. The sheriff's face bore the marks of that same history. He was only in his early 40s, but his eyes carried years beyond. Deep-set and hazel, they had seen deserts, rainforests, and far too many hospital wards lit by sterile lights. His jawline was sharp, clean-shaven by habit, his dark hair cropped close, a streak of silver cutting through at the temple. He was not a man people described as approachable, but when he spoke, his voice carried a calm weight that made even doubters still their objections. As he walked the main street, townsfolk glanced up briefly from their chores. A nod here, a lift of 2 fingers from a glove there. Silverpine did not speak much to its sheriff, but it trusted him, the way mountains trust the cedars, clinging to their slopes. He didn't need to chatter. His presence itself was reassurance. At the corner by the bakery, Elias paused. Brutus stopped as well, ears swiveling. The scent of bread drifted faintly, though the shutters were still drawn. Frost feathered the glass. A delivery truck had left tire tracks that already blurred under a thin layer of snow. Elias shifted his weight slightly, scanning the street. He kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of his coat, where he wrote observations that others might dismiss. A light left on too late, a shed door swinging open, a stranger's footprints trailing out of town. He didn't always know why he wrote them. He just knew that in a place like Silverpine, details were the only clues you'd ever get. Brutus gave a low whuff, almost a sigh, and Elias glanced down. The dog's eyes were fixed on the far end of the street, where the bridge curved toward the cabins beyond the river. Nothing moved there. Not yet. But the shepherd's ears had pricked forward. Elias murmured, "Easy, boy." The words weren't an order, just a reminder. Calm passes from man to dog as much as from dog to man. Together they resumed their walk, their footsteps leaving twin tracks side by side. Past the hardware store, where a faded sign squeaked in the wind. Past the post office, its flag frozen stiff on the pole. Past the sawmill road, where snow gathered in drifts like white sand, hiding the broken beams and rusting saws. Everywhere, the stillness of Silverpine pressed in, like a secret, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. Elias had learned patience. Brutus had never known anything else. They turned down toward the riverbank, where ice cracked faintly under its own shifting weight. Brutus stopped again, lifting his nose. His breath fogged in short bursts as he inhaled, then exhaled, then inhaled again. He didn't growl, not yet, but his tail stiffened. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the cabins across the bridge. Something had changed there on the last day. He could feel it, though he couldn't name it. The way smoke curled thinner from a chimney, the way tire tracks cut fresher into the snow, the way Brutus's instincts leaned forward, as if tugged by a thread. "All right," Elias murmured, giving the leash a gentle tug. Brutus fell back into step, obedient but unwilling to take his gaze from the woods. It wasn't unusual for Silverpine to feel uneasy. The town thrived on unspoken things, on memories left to rot in the soil. But as Elias and Brutus made their way back up the slope, the sheriff felt the weight of his partner's unease pressing against his own ribs. Brutus's ears twitched again. Elias jotted a note in his book without looking. Dog unsettled near cabins. Watch. For Elias Ward, it was never the loud events that demanded his attention. It was the quiet shifts, the silence heavier than usual, the way Brutus's amber eyes tracked something invisible that told him trouble was on the horizon. And in Silverpine, trouble rarely knocked on doors. It waited, hidden in the snow, until it could no longer be ignored. The path behind Silverpine's community library wound through a corridor of cedar trees, their trunks tall and close together, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The snow was thin here, scattered in patches where light filtered through, crunching softly beneath boots and wheels. The air smelled of resin and frost, sharp and clean. Yet it carried a weight, as though the forest itself had grown wary of intruders. Sheriff Elias Ward walked with Brutus at his side, their pace steady and unhurried. Elias carried no expectation of trouble, but his eyes, as always, swept the surroundings with quiet vigilance. His breath fogged in the cold, dissipating into silence. Brutus's pause made almost no sound at all. The shepherd's amber gaze darted ahead, ears flicking with restless precision. It was Brutus who noticed them first. His head lifted, nostrils flaring. The hair along his spine rose in a faint ripple. Then Elias saw them, 3 figures rounding the bend. Verena Cross came first, her beige coat buttoned to her throat, her braid neat against her shoulder. She pushed a wheelchair with measured steadiness, her movements graceful, deliberate, almost rehearsed. In the chair sat Leora, her scarf tucked under her chin, her face pale against the winter light. A stuffed rabbit with a missing eye rested in her lap, one ear bent like it was listening. Behind them trailed Maren, hands shoved deep into her pockets, her beanie pulled low, her gaze darting everywhere but the path ahead. When the groups drew near, Elias lifted a gloved hand. "Morning." His voice was calm, low, a simple acknowledgement. Verena returned a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sheriff." Her tone was smooth, polite, pitched to sound casual. "Just taking the girls out for some fresh air." Before Elias could reply, Brutus moved. The dog's body angled sharply, stepping between his handler and the woman, shoulders squared, head low. A soft, guttural growl stirred from his chest. Not loud, but deep, unsettling in its certainty. His amber eyes never left Verena's face. Elias's hand rested quickly on the harness. "Easy," he murmured, though his gaze sharpened. Brutus was no reckless animal. If he growled, it was because something beneath the surface had unsettled him. Verena's smile tightened, but she crouched slightly, as though amused. "Beautiful dog. Retired canine, yes. Still protective, I see." Her words dripped with feigned warmth. Elias studied her for a beat too long before nodding once. "Still has opinions," he said flatly. Leora sat motionless in her chair, her gaze fixed on nothing. Yet when Elias looked closer, he saw the faint tremor in her gloved fingers against the rabbit's fur. She did not flinch when Brutus drew near. She almost leaned toward him, as though unconsciously seeking shelter in his presence. Behind them, Maren shifted closer to her sister, her eyes sharp and restless. For the briefest moment, as Verena adjusted the wheelchair, Maren's gaze flicked to Elias. A glance, quick, desperate, almost too fleeting to catch. But Elias did catch it. He'd seen that look before, in war zones, in refugee camps, in children whose mouths stayed silent, but whose eyes begged someone to notice. "You're new in town," Elias said finally, his tone even but probing. Verena straightened, brushing snow from her glove. "Yes. I thought a change of scenery would be good for the girls." She gestured to the forest. "It's peaceful here. Healing, don't you think?" Brutus's growl deepened, not aggressive but unsettled, his ears pinned slightly back. Elias kept his hand firm on the harness, masking the tension in his shoulders. "Peaceful," he echoed, though the word felt out of place in his mouth. A silence followed, polite on the surface, thick underneath. Snow fell in small flurries, drifting between them. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Maren scuffed her boot against the frozen path, her voice sharp but quiet. Smells like mushrooms out here too. Verena shot her a look that ended the conversation instantly. Her smile plastered back into place as she turned to Elias. We'll be seeing more of each other, I'm sure. Small town, after all. Elias inclined his head, though his eyes lingered on the twins. Maren kept her gaze locked on him for half a heartbeat longer before snapping it away, jaw clenched. Leora never lifted her eyes at all, though the rabbit shifted slightly in her lap, gripped tighter. Take care on the trail, Elias said finally. And you, Sheriff, Verena replied, her voice smooth as glass. As the trio moved past, Brutus twisted his head, watching them until they disappeared around the bend. His body remained tense, tail stiff, ears forward, as if unwilling to turn his back on something he could not yet name. Elias stroked the dog's neck once, murmuring, "All right, boy." But he felt it too, that prickle at the base of the spine, the instinct honed over years that whispered something's off. He opened his notebook later that evening, the same one filled with mundane observations of lights, tracks, and weather. With deliberate strokes, he wrote, "Met woman, Verena Cross, 2 girls, dog unsettled, watch." The sun dipped lower behind the ridges as Elias Ward made his way back toward the station. Silver Pine's streets were almost empty, save for the thin trail of smoke rising from chimneys and the occasional crunch of boots echoing across the snow. The hush of evening settled fast in this valley, a kind of quiet that pressed into the ribs and made a man take stock of his own breathing. Brutus padded close at his side, tail stiff, ears twitching every few steps. The dog's pace was steady, but there was a tension in him, like a string pulled taut, waiting for a note to be struck. Elias noticed the way his partner's eyes kept flicking back toward the forest path they'd left behind. "Something's chewing at you," Elias muttered under his breath. He reached down, gloved fingers brushing the coarse fur at Brutus's shoulder. The shepherd didn't ease, not fully. His breath came in short bursts, fogging against the darkening air, his head snapping once toward a sound that wasn't there. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a squat brick building at the edge of town, the sky had bruised into a deeper gray. Elias pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like an old man woken from a nap. Brutus followed him inside, shaking snow from his coat before circling once near the desk, finally settling at Elias's boots, but still alert, ears pivoting with each creak of the building. The sheriff shrugged off his patrol coat and hung it on the hook by the door. His body carried fatigue, but his mind carried something heavier. He sat at the desk, pulled the small black notebook from his pocket, and laid it on the worn surface. He hesitated. Normally, he didn't bother logging casual encounters. Silverpine was too small for that kind of formality. A scribbled note about a power outage here, a reminder to check the East Bridge for ice there. That was the usual weight of his entries. But tonight felt different. The silence Brutus had broken on the trail still hummed in Elias's ears. He flipped the notebook open and clicked his pen. His handwriting was steady, blocky, the kind of script taught in the military and never unlearned. Met woman, Verena Cross. 2 girls in her care. Dog unsettled, growled, positioned between. Girls, 1 wheelchair-bound, 1 guarded, evasive. Something doesn't fit. He underlined the last sentence once, then set the pen down. His jaw tightened as he read the words again. They looked heavier on paper than they'd sounded in his head. Brutus shifted at his feet, letting out a low whuff that wasn't quite a sigh. Elias glanced down. The shepherd's amber eyes glowed in the dim lamplight, fixed not on his handler, but on the window beyond, where frost had crept in jagged lines across the glass. The dog's ears twitched, then flattened briefly, as if something outside unsettled him all over again. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "You don't spook easy," he said quietly. He had seen Brutus face fire, collapsing ceilings, even gunfire. The dog had never flinched without reason. Tonight, though, tonight he had drawn a line in the snow between Elias and that woman, his growl soft but certain. The sheriff closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer, locking it with a small click. He turned off the lamp and stood, pacing toward the window. The street outside lay empty, only a single lantern burning at the post office. Snow whispered down from the sky, each flake catching the faint glow before disappearing into the dark. Something stirred in his gut. Not fear, not yet, but the kind of unease that grows in silence, the way a fracture spreads under ice before anyone can see it. His instincts told him one thing. What he had witnessed was not ordinary, and it would not stay contained. Brutus rose, padding to the window beside him, pressing his nose against the cold glass. A low vibration ran through his chest, not quite a growl, more like a reminder. Pay attention. Elias placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady thrum of muscle beneath fur. "I know," he murmured. His voice was softer than usual, carrying something almost like resignation. "I feel it too." The building creaked, settling into the night. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, then fell silent. Elias stayed by the window longer than he needed to, his reflection merging with Brutus's in the frost-streaked glass. A man and a dog, both marked by scars, both listening to a warning only they seemed to hear. When he finally moved, it was with the weight of a man who knew the first thread of something larger had just been pulled. He shut the blinds, checked the locks, and let the office sink into silence. Brutus circled once, then lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes still open. Elias sat again at his desk, staring at the dark wood grain, his thoughts circling the way Brutus's body had circled before settling. Something didn't fit. And in Silverpine, when something didn't fit, it usually meant the ground beneath your feet wasn't solid. It was waiting to give way. Night in Silverpine carried its own kind of silence. It wasn't the soft hush of city sleep, nor the calm of countryside fields. It was heavier, like the snow itself, pressing down on the earth, muting every sound, smothering every whisper. In the cabin on the ridge, the silence settled so thick it became something alive, something that seemed to breathe along with the walls. Leora lay in her narrow bed by the back wall, her wheelchair folded near the nightstand. The stuffed rabbit rested against her chest, its fabric worn thin, the missing button eye staring at the ceiling. Her sister Marin had drifted into a restless sleep on the other bed, turning now and then, fists clenched into the blanket, as if even her dreams carried resistance. Leora's own eyes fluttered closed, but rest did not come gently. The dream arrived the way it always did, quiet at first, then sharp. She was back on the staircase of their old house. Wide oak steps stretched downward, familiar, worn smooth by years of running feet. The banister gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. For a moment she felt steady, balanced, as though she could still control the wheels of her chair. But then, pressure, a presence behind her. Not a hand she could see, but a weight she could feel, pressing down between her shoulders. A shift in the floorboard, the sound of breath too close to her ear. She tried to turn, tried to call out, but the chair jolted forward, momentum seizing control. The world tilted, The wheels spun too fast, slamming against wood. Her heart leapt into her throat. Then the impact came. Sharp, violent, endless. The scream caught in her chest, swallowed by the sound of her body tumbling into darkness. The dream froze at that moment, as it always did, leaving her suspended in the terror of falling, but never reaching the ground. Leora's eyes snapped open. The room was dark, shadows stretching long across the ceiling from the faint light leaking under the door. Her breath came shallow, each inhale scraping her throat. She clutched the rabbit tighter, pressing her face into its faded fabric as though it could shield her from the memory that refused to let go. Then she heard it. The creak of the floorboards above, followed by the muffled cadence of Verina's voice. Not the soft lilt of a caretaker, but the sharp, quick rhythm of someone negotiating, calculating. "Yes, it's handled," Verina murmured, her tone low, though every syllable seemed to pierce the silence. A pause. "No, the paperwork won't be challenged. She doesn't remember." Another pause, sharper this time. "Just trust me." The words bled through the thin walls, half strangled by distance, but enough for Leora to feel their weight. She didn't need to know every word. She understood what lay underneath, the cold certainty that Verina's voice never carried when speaking to them. Leora turned her head toward Maren's bed. Her sister shifted in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent, her body curled tight, as though protecting herself from some unseen blow. For a moment, Leora thought of whispering her name, of pulling her awake to share the fear that gnawed at her ribs. But the words died before they reached her lips. She stared instead at the ceiling, eyes wide, listening to the rise and fall of Verina's voice above. The phone call ended with the muted click of footsteps pacing, then the long groan of a bed frame. Silence returned, but it was the kind that rang louder than sound itself. Leora pressed her fingers against the seam of the blanket, rubbing the fabric back and forth until her nails stung. She whispered into the dark, voice no louder than breath. "I didn't fall." The rabbit's torn ear brushed against her cheek, a fragile reminder of before. Before the stairs, before the silence that had sealed itself into her chest. She closed her eyes again, but sleep hovered just out of reach, teasing her with shadows and the echo of a voice that didn't belong to safety. Her body remembered the fall, even if her mind tried to push it away. Every jolt of the chair, every flash of the banister rushing past, every impossible second when she knew something, someone, had tipped her into that void. Now, lying in the cold quiet of the cabin, she realized the fall had never ended. It followed her, night after night, disguised as dreams, but rooted in truth. She wasn't haunted by the accident. She was haunted by the knowledge that it had never been one. The creak of the roof above shifted again, and for the first time since waking, Leora allowed her eyes to blur with tears. She turned her face into the pillow, hiding even from her sleeping sister. And in that moment, as snow whispered against the windows and the rocking chair on the porch groaned faintly with no wind to move it, Leora made a silent vow. She would not let her voice stay buried forever. Not when the truth still breathed in the shadows of this house. The cabin's walls were thin, and for Maren, thin walls meant opportunity. She lay awake long after her sister's breath had steadied into the shallow rhythm of half-sleep. The room was dark, only the faintest glow of moonlight edging past the frosted window. Her eyes traced cracks in the ceiling, her ears tuned to every sound above. When Verena moved, the whole house seemed to notice. Floorboards creaked with a practiced rhythm, steady and quick. Then came the murmur of her voice again, low, deliberate, not the clipped commands she gave the girls, but the smoother tone she reserved for those who mattered in her schemes. Maren rolled to her side, heart thudding. Something in her gut told her she couldn't just lie there this time. She slipped from bed, careful not to disturb Leora, and padded across the cold wooden floor. Her socks muffled her steps, but the old boards still whispered faint protests beneath her weight. She froze after each one, listening. At the back door, she wrapped her fingers around the brass knob, holding her breath as she turned it. The latch gave way with a faint click, and a rush of frigid air slipped inside. She pulled the door open just wide enough to slide through, wincing as it creaked. Outside, the night bit at her cheeks, sharp and unforgiving. The forest loomed around the cabin, cedar branches heavy with snow, the ground littered with patches of moonlit frost. She tucked her chin into her scarf and moved along the porch, keeping to the shadows. Voices drifted from beyond the tree line. One was Verina's, unmistakable, clipped even when hushed. The other belonged to a man, deeper, curt, with the edge of someone used to being obeyed. Maren crept closer, her breath fogging, her small boots crunching softly in the crusted snow. She crouched behind a cedar trunk, the bark rough against her palms. "The guardianship transfer is already in motion," Verena was saying. "No one's going to question it. She doesn't remember. She can't." Maren's chest tightened. She knew immediately who she was. Leora. Her sister. The accident. The fall. The words twisted in her head like barbed wire. The man grunted, unimpressed. "You'd better hope you're right. If the paperwork doesn't hold up—" "It will," Verena snapped, then softened her tone. "The girl in the chair barely speaks. She's easy to manage. It's the other one I'm watching." Maren's stomach dropped, as if the snow beneath her had given way. The other one. That was her. Her nails dug into the cedar's bark. She wanted to burst from hiding, to scream at Verena, to claw at the stranger's coat until they admitted everything. But her body refused, trembling too hard to move. She pressed her lips together, biting back the hot sting of tears. The man's voice came again, quieter but sharper. "Keep the younger one under control. Fear works better than kindness. Don't forget that." Maren's breath hitched. A branch cracked under her boot as she shifted. Verena's head jerked up. "What was that?" The man turned, scanning the trees. Maren's heart thudded so violently she thought it might echo through the branches. She flattened herself against the cedar trunk, hardly daring to breathe. Snow fell in slow spirals around her, landing in her hair, melting on her cheeks. She counted the seconds, each one a hammer blow in her chest, until Verena finally exhaled. "Probably a deer. They come too close sometimes." The man grunted again, unconvinced, but didn't press. Their voices trailed as they moved back toward the cabin's edge, words slipping into indistinct murmurs. Maren stayed hidden until silence reclaimed the woods. Only then did she peel herself away from the cedar, her body trembling with cold and adrenaline. She staggered back toward the cabin, her breath coming fast, fogging the air in sharp bursts. Inside, the warmth felt wrong, stifling, suffocating. She slipped back into the bedroom, closing the door with the same care she had when leaving. Leora stirred faintly, but didn't wake. Maren leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling, her fists clenched at her sides. Fear gnawed at her ribs, sharp and deep, but beneath it something else had begun to take root. Resolve. She looked at her sister, pale in sleep, the stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Leora had carried her silence like a wound, never speaking of the fall, never speaking much at all. But Maren had just heard the truth fall from Verena's own lips. She doesn't remember. But Maren knew her sister did, maybe not in words, but in the shadowed look in her eyes, in the way she whispered to herself when she thought no one could hear. Maren swallowed hard, jaw tightening. If no one else would protect her sister, she would. The fear was still there, but now it burned with a different flame. A secret she couldn't tell, not yet. A burden too heavy for a child, but one she carried anyway, because she had no choice. She crawled back into her bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her fists still clenched beneath. Her heart thudded loud in her ears, but she kept her eyes open, staring at the ceiling cracks until they blurred. In the stillness of the cabin, she whispered to herself, a vow sealed in the dark. She's not alone. Not while I'm here. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the porch chair. Snow fell harder, as if the forest itself listened and waited. The bell above the clinic door jingled softly as Elias pushed it open. A wave of warmth greeted him, carrying the faint, mingled scents of antiseptic and baked bread from the bakery next door. The contrast with the brittle air outside made the space feel like an oasis, though it was a modest one. Whitewashed walls, shelves lined with jars and gauze, a counter cluttered with handwritten notes, and a chipped mug of tea gone cold. Brutus hesitated at the threshold, his nails clicking against the tile before he padded inside. His ears twitched at the sound of the door closing, his amber eyes sweeping the room with the same vigilance he carried everywhere. Elias gave the leash a small tug, murmuring, "In." The dog obeyed, but did not relax, his shoulders taut, his breathing short and uneven. Behind the counter, Dr. Miriam Hale emerged, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her copper-brown hair was tied back into a ponytail, a few loose strands catching the lamplight. Her forest-green eyes, sharp and steady, softened when they landed on Brutus. "Well," she said, voice quiet but tinged with affection, "if it isn't my favorite patient." Brutus gave no acknowledgement except for a flick of one ear. He wasn't wagging, not like he sometimes did when Miriam slipped him a biscuit. Today, he stood rigid, head low, as if expecting something to strike from the shadows. Miriam's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Elias loosened the leash slightly, letting the shepherd circle once before settling near the exam table. "He's been restless," Elias said. His voice was even, but Miriam knew him well enough to hear the concern beneath. "Growling without cause, putting himself between me and people on the trail." "Which people?" Miriam asked. Elias hesitated. "Newcomer. Woman. 2 girls." Miriam didn't press yet. She crouched beside Brutus, running a practiced hand along his flank, fingers pressing gently against the thick coat. The shepherd stiffened but didn't resist. His muscles quivered faintly under her touch, more tension than tremor. "Heart rates elevated," she murmured, listening to his chest with her stethoscope. Brutus's breaths came fast, shallow, each inhale catching slightly. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's picking up something." Elias leaned against the counter, arms folded. He watched the dog, but his gaze was distant, fixed somewhere in the memory of the snowy path where Brutus had bristled at Verena Cross. Miriam glanced up at him, reading more in his silence than in his words. "He doesn't do this for no reason," she said softly. "No," Elias agreed. His voice was rough, low. "He doesn't." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the hum of the space heater in the corner filled the room, its warmth cutting the edge of winter that clung to their coats. Miriam kept her hand on Brutus's side, grounding him with steady pressure. She felt the dog's heartbeat under her palm, strong but faster than it should have been. "You remember that fire?" Elias said suddenly. His eyes were still fixed on nothing, his tone edged with memory. Miriam's hand stilled briefly, then resumed. "Of course I do." "He didn't flinch then," Elias continued. "Not when the ceiling came down, not even when the boy screamed. But today, with that woman—" His voice trailed off. He shook his head once, slow. "He knew something. I just don't know what." Miriam straightened, studying Elias. There was weariness in the set of his jaw, a shadow in his hazel eyes that hadn't been there when they were kids running these same streets. War had carved it into him, and Silverpine had not taken it away. "You've always trusted his instincts," she said gently. "I do," Elias answered. "That's the problem." Brutus shifted, lying down near Elias's boots, but keeping his head lifted, ears pricked. His gaze followed shadows moving along the frosted window, as if something outside pressed against the glass. Miriam stepped closer to Elias, lowering her voice. "You think this woman's dangerous?" Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked down to Brutus, then back to Miriam. "I think," he said carefully, "that in Silverpine, nothing arrives without a reason, and nothing stays quiet forever." The weight of the words lingered between them, heavier than the air in the room. Miriam reached for her mug of tea, forgetting it had gone cold. She set it back down, her fingers tapping absently against the ceramic. "You'll watch her," she said finally. Elias nodded once. "I already am." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of the heater and the steady, uneven breaths of the dog filling the space. Miriam's concern for Brutus was written plainly on her face, but beneath it was something more, an unspoken bond with the man standing before her. Years had carried them apart and back together again, but the language of worry was one they both still understood. She crouched once more, pressing her forehead briefly against Brutus's. "You'll tell us, won't you?" she whispered, her voice meant only for the dog. "Whatever it is, you'll let us know." Brutus blinked slowly, a steady, silent answer. Elias looked away, his throat tightening for reasons he didn't put to words. He reached down, resting a hand on Brutus's neck, fingers brushing the scar there. "We'll listen," he said quietly. And in the hush of the small clinic, with snow still falling outside and secrets pressing against the edges of the town, Elias felt the truth settle in his bones. Brutus wasn't wrong. Something was coming. Something he couldn't yet name. The wind chased Elias up the narrow trail, carrying fine flecks of ice that stung against his cheeks. Snow had thickened since dawn, muting the forest in a hush that was almost reverent. Brutus moved ahead of him, paws breaking the powder with practiced grace, nose low to the ground. Each step forward seemed to quicken the pull in Elias's chest, a familiar tension that came before he knocked on any door where something didn't feel quite right. The cabin appeared suddenly from the tree line, smoke curling from the chimney, a yellow glow leaking through the frost-laced windows. Picturesque, too picturesque. Elias slowed, adjusting his hat, letting his breath settle before climbing the porch steps. Brutus followed, tail held stiff, ears sharp as arrowheads. Elias knocked once, firm, but not forceful. The door opened seconds later, and there she was, Verena Cross. Her smile was immediate, practiced, too quick. "Sheriff Ward," she greeted, voice sweet as warm cider. "What a surprise." "Routine wellness check," Elias said, his tone steady, professional. "Snow like this, I like to make sure folks are settled in, especially new arrivals." Verena's eyes crinkled at the corners, but the warmth didn't reach them. "That's thoughtful of you." She stepped aside. "Please, come in. You must be freezing." Inside, the cabin was tidy, fire crackling in the hearth, the scent of pine resin thick in the air. On the surface, nothing amiss. Yet Brutus hesitated before entering, gaze sweeping the corners as if searching for something unseen. When he finally padded in, he bypassed Verena completely and positioned himself beside a wheelchair parked near the hearth. The girl in it, Leora, sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her dark hair curtained her pale face, eyes cast downward. She didn't speak, didn't even glance at him, though Brutus leaned close, pressing his body protectively against her chair. "Beautiful dog," Verena said lightly, closing the door. "I imagine he's useful in these mountains." "He is," Elias replied. His gaze shifted from Leora to the other girl, Maren, who lingered by the kitchen doorway. She was still, almost too still, her hand gripping the edge of the wood as if anchoring herself. "You must be Maren," Elias said gently. Her eyes flicked to him, then away. "Yes, sir," she murmured. "You two settling in all right?" A pause. Maren nodded, but the motion was clipped, mechanical. "Yes, it's fine here." Verena stepped closer, her hand landing on Maren's shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate, but pinned her in place. "The girls are adjusting well," she said smoothly. "This is a safe haven for them after everything." Elias caught it then, the tiniest flinch in Maren's shoulders gone in an instant. He tucked the detail into memory, expression calm. "Good to hear," he said. "Mind if I ask a few questions? Just routine." "Of course." Verena's smile widened, teeth gleaming too perfectly. Elias took out his small notebook, flipping it open. "Leora, is it?" he asked, glancing toward the girl in the wheelchair. She didn't respond. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress, knuckles pale. Brutus gave a low, reassuring rumble, resting his head against the wheel, as though anchoring her. "She's shy," Verena supplied quickly. "Still recovering, poor thing. It's best not to overwhelm her." Elias's eyes lingered on the girl. Shy wasn't the right word. He looked shy. This was something heavier, layered with silence that felt forced. He shifted his gaze to Maren again. "And you? Everything you need?" Maren swallowed. Her lips parted, then closed again. "Yes, we're fine." The pause before "fine" was too long. Elias noted it with a flick of his pen. Verena gave a delicate laugh, hand smoothing Maren's hair. "You'll have to excuse them. They've been through a lot. I try to keep things simple here. Calm." "Of course," Elias murmured. He closed the notebook with a quiet snap. For a few moments, silence filled the room, broken only by the fire and the steady drip of snowmelt sliding from the eaves. Elias's gaze swept the cabin, the two neat shelves, the perfectly folded blanket on the couch, the absence of toys or clutter one might expect in a home with children. Everything is curated, controlled. Brutus shifted, ears twitching, eyes never leaving Leora. The dog's presence was a weight in the room, grounding Elias's unease. Animals didn't play politics and didn't get fooled by practiced smiles. They sensed what lay beneath, and Brutus was sensing plenty. Elias rose slowly. "Well, everything looks in order. I'll be checking back in, of course. Snow can make things unpredictable up here." "Of course," Verena said, her smile unwavering. "We'll look forward to it." Maren's eyes darted to him then, just for a heartbeat. Something raw flickered there. Fear, or maybe plea. But Verena's hand tightened on her shoulder, and the moment was gone. Elias tipped his hat. "Good day, then." As he stepped out into the cold, Brutus lingered by the wheelchair, eyes locked on Leora, until the very last second. Only when Elias called did the shepherd move, muscles taut, hackles faintly raised. The door closed behind them, shutting in the warmth, but the chill that traveled Elias's spine had little to do with winter. Walking back through the snow, he kept his notebook tucked under one arm, his gloved hand brushing the leather cover. Inside, 3 words stood stark in his steady handwriting. Something doesn't fit. The cabin had quieted after Elias's wellness check, but the silence inside was anything but calm. The fire had burned low, crackling softly, shadows lengthening along the log walls. Elias sat at the small wooden table, his notebook untouched, his hands folded in front of him, as though he were waiting for something he couldn't yet name. Brutus lay at his feet, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, though his ears remained pricked, every nerve alert. Across the room, Leora's wheelchair faced the window, her small frame swallowed by the heavy blanket draped over her knees. She hadn't spoken the entire visit. Not a word, not a glance. Her eyes had stayed down, lashes trembling against pale cheeks. But now, in the hushed air, Elias sensed a shift, a faint tremor, like the first crack in lake ice before the thaw. He rose carefully, moving toward her, each step deliberate. "Leora," he said softly, voice pitched lower than when he'd spoken to Verena. "I know it's hard. You don't have to say anything. But if you want to..." Her fingers tightened against the armrest, knuckles whitening. For a moment he thought she wouldn't. Then, barely audible, thinner than breath, words spilled out, fractured and halting. "I didn't fall." Elias froze. His pulse jumped, but his face remained composed, trained over years of holding steady when the ground shifted under him. He crouched so his eyes were level with hers, trying to make himself smaller, safer. Her lips trembled. She swallowed hard, then forced the rest out, the words breaking like shards of glass. "I was pushed." The whisper hit the room like thunder. Even Brutus lifted his head, ears flicking, eyes sharp. Elias's gut clenched, but his training held. He kept his voice calm, gentle, though every instinct screamed that the world had just tilted. "Leora," he said carefully, "are you sure?" Her eyes darted toward the doorway, wide and dark with fear. And that was when Elias understood she wasn't just remembering. She was afraid of being heard, because someone was listening. From the narrow hallway beyond the kitchen came the faintest creak of wood. Elias's body stilled, muscles tightening beneath his coat. He didn't turn, didn't give the hallway his attention, but his peripheral vision caught the shadow that lingered there. Verena. Her figure was half hidden, still as carved stone, one hand braced against the frame. She had heard. The mask she wore so easily had slipped for a moment. Elias caught the flash of it. Surprise, then calculation, then something darker hardening in her eyes, before her face smoothed again. Elias turned back to Leora, lowering his voice even more. "Thank you for telling me," he whispered. "You're very brave." Her hand trembled on the blanket. Brutus pressed closer, resting his muzzle on her knee, grounding her with his quiet strength. Behind them, the creak of the hallway vanished. Verena stepped forward at last, her smile already in place, too wide, too quick. "Well," she said brightly, "I'll put on some tea. Sheriff, you must be chilled after your walk." Elias straightened, slow and deliberate, turning to face her. Her eyes met his, calm, unblinking, daring him to challenge what he'd heard. "Tea would be good," Elias said evenly, though the air between them carried an edge sharp as a blade. Verena moved to the stove, the rustle of her dress deliberate, casual. But Elias saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were just a fraction too precise as she reached for the kettle. He stayed near Leora, his hand brushing over Brutus's back, feeling the steady thrum of muscle beneath fur. The girl had whispered her truth, and now the cabin was no longer just warm timber and firelight. It was a stage set with secrets, and every breath carried weight. Elias didn't write the words down in his notebook. Not yet. Some truths were too fragile to set in ink too soon. Instead, he let silence fill the room, broken only by the hiss of the kettle and the faint whistle of wind outside. But his mind repeated the whisper again and again, like a bell tolling in the distance, unshakable. "I didn't fall. I was pushed," and he knew. This wasn't just a wellness check anymore. This was the edge of something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than he had realized. The snow began its descent just as Elias stepped back out into the night. At first, it was only a fine drift, lazy flakes twirling in the pale glow of the cabin's lantern. But within minutes, the air thickened, the forest dissolving into soft, white silence. Elias tugged his collar high and tightened his scarf. Behind him, the cabin's windows glowed warm, the silhouettes of Verena's careful movements flitting against the firelit walls. Leora's whisper echoed in his chest, each word carried with the sting of cold air. "I didn't fall. I was pushed." Brutus pressed close to his leg, his body taut, though no danger showed itself. The shepherd's breath plumed in the dark, nose lifted toward the forest, ears pricked. His unease had become Elias's compass. The night pressed down heavier than it should. The snow muffled everything. The wind, the trees, even the creek below the ridge. And yet, from somewhere beyond the line of spruce, a lone sound cut through the quiet. Archer's howl. It rose long and mournful, stretching over the valley like a lament. Not the bay of a dog calling for company, but a sharper, older sound, something primal, carrying with it a sense of warning. Brutus stiffened beside him, head snapping toward the direction of the cry. Elias's hand rested on the dog's back, steadying him, though his own pulse quickened. The forest answered with silence. Elias stood still, listening. Each breath he drew came heavy with the smell of wood smoke and snow. Something about the howl had unsettled him, as though it had been meant not for the wild, but for him. A signal, a reminder. Inside the cabin, shadows shifted. Through the window, he caught sight of Verena's face for a fraction of a second, perfectly composed, lips curled in that too bright smile as she bent to clear the table. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing. But Elias had seen enough masks in his life to know when one had been nailed on too tightly. He turned away, trudging down the narrow path that wound toward town. Each step crunched in the deepening snow, each sound swallowed quickly by the storm. Brutus stayed close, his presence steady but restless, glancing over his shoulder as though reluctant to leave. Halfway down the ridge, Elias paused beneath a pine heavy with fresh white. He pulled out his notebook, its cover stiff with cold. By the light of his lantern, he flipped past pages of neat, spare entries until he found the fresh one from earlier. He uncapped his pen, hesitated. Then, slowly, he wrote, "Lyora." Whispered, she was pushed. He stopped, staring at the words as though they might burn through the page. His training urged him to catalogue details, to commit them for the record. Yet another part of him, a quieter, older instinct, warned against putting too much down too soon. Words on paper could be stolen, twisted, and there were eyes in this valley sharper than he cared to admit. He snapped the notebook shut. Brutus huffed softly, shifting his weight. Elias crouched beside him, brushing ice crystals from the shepherd's fur. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured. "Something doesn't fit." Brutus's amber eyes flicked to his, steady, unreadable, but there was a tension in the dog's posture, a readiness Elias had learned never to dismiss. Above them, Archer's howl came again, this time closer, sharper, less like mourning, more like warning. The snow thickened, the world shrinking to a narrow tunnel of white. Elias tucked the notebook back inside his coat, rising to his full height. The howl lingered in his bones as he resumed walking, a reminder that the reckoning was drawing near. At the cabin, the fire burned, warm and inviting. But the warmth felt false now, a painted glow over something colder, darker. And Elias knew, with the certainty of a man who had walked into storms before, that the silence after tonight was not peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. The snow had thinned by morning, but the forest still held its breath, brittle and hushed after the storm. Elias hadn't expected company that day. He was oiling his boots by the hearth when the knock came. Brisk, rehearsed. Verena stood at the door, a porcelain smile, polished to perfection. "I thought a walk might do us all good," she said lightly. "The girls are restless. The path by the old ranger station is clear this time of year." Elias studied her too long before setting the boots aside. That trail wound near a ravine, miles from any working road. No signal, no help. He knew it, and Verena knew he knew it. Still, he agreed. Declining would raise suspicion, and truthfully, he wanted to see her away from watchers. Brutus met them at the door, tail low, but ears high, ready. Snow crunched beneath their steps as they set off, Elias behind Verena, the shepherd padding between them like a shadow. The trail wound narrow beneath skeletal pines, sunlight thin and grey. A crow rattled its wings and vanished into the white sky. Elias's breath plumed steady, though his heart beat too fast for the pace. Verena chatted as though the world were simple, soup simmering, the girls laughing at a radio tune. Yet her voice carried that silken quality Elias always distrusted, polished floors, hiding rot. After half an hour, they reached the ranger station, a husk of timber and broken glass, roof sagging under years of snow. Elias remembered when it had been manned. Now it stood like a rib cage against the sky. Brutus stopped short, muscles taut, tail rigid, a low rumble in his chest. "Strange," Verena mused, eyes never leaving Elias. "I sometimes hear voices there at night. Wind, most likely." Elias crouched, hand on Brutus's shoulder. The shepherd's unease throbbed under his palm. Beyond the ruin, the ravine cut black through the snow. No tracks, no sound, only silence. They pressed on, the path narrowing until only one could walk at a time. Verena led, boots sure over ice. Elias followed, every instinct prickling. The slope dropped mercilessly left, stone waiting below. "Not many come here anymore," she called back. "Peaceful, don't you think?" Elias almost smiled at the word. Peaceful, like Leora's halting whisper that still haunted him. "I didn't fall. I was pushed." Brutus pressed close against his leg, herding him from the edge. Elias finally asked, "Why this trail?" Her smile never wavered. "Nostalgia." "My father said places like this remind you how small you are." Small. Elias glanced at the rocks yawning below. Yes, small was one word for it. Brutus halted again, hackles faint. Elias murmured, "Something doesn't fit." Verena turned, pale light softening her face. "You always look as if you're solving a riddle. Sometimes things are exactly as they seem, and sometimes they aren't." The words cut the frozen air like glass. For a long moment, only snow drifting from branches answered. Then Verena laughed lightly and led them back down the trail as though nothing had passed. Elias lingered, staring at the ravine. He imagined a body tumbling, breaking on the rocks, the silence after. Brutus nudged him back, and Elias followed, though his thoughts circled the same truth. Whatever shadow haunted that house, it led here, to cliffs and silence where no one could hear you cry. By afternoon, the cold sharpened, turning sound brittle. Snow had been packed to ice along the path. Maren strained behind her sister's wheelchair, wheels squealing. Leora sat swaddled, pale, her eyes flicking often to the ravine. Elias had warned her quietly the night before. "Keep steady. Don't let them see fear." But Elias wasn't here. Only Verena's velvet voice, honey in the air. "You're strong, Maren," Verena said smoothly. "Your sister is lucky to have you. She trusts you, doesn't she?" Maren flushed, breath quickening. "Of course she does." "Then show her. A little more speed. The slope is smooth. She'll feel free, like flying." Maren hesitated, hands clenching the handles. Brutus padded near the edge, ears pricked, body angled toward the ditch. "I don't know if that's safe," she whispered. "Safe?" Verena laughed softly. "Don't you think she's tired of being treated like glass? She wants to feel alive. Just a little push." The word "afraid" clung like a taunt. Maren's throat bobbed. Then, almost without meaning to, she leaned forward. The chair lurched. Wheels squealed. "Verena!" Leora's cry cut sharp and thin. The slope dipped steeper than Maren realized. The chair veered, one wheel skidding on ice. Brutus barked, frantic, claws tearing the trail. "Stop it, Maren!" Leora's voice cracked. Maren lunged, but the chair had slipped free. It jolted violently, tilting toward the ditch. "Hold it steady!" Verena's command rang behind, cool, unhurried, as if observing theater. Brutus slammed into the chair's side, his weight dragging it back. Snow sprayed, his growl a raw anchor. The wheels shuddered to a halt, inches from the drop. Leora clutched the armrests, chest heaving, tears brimming. Maren froze, staring at her trembling hands. She had wanted to prove herself, but her sister's terror hollowed her. Her knees buckled. "I didn't mean—" Verena's hand touched her shoulder, firm and cool. "Shh! An accident. Everyone slips." But Maren recoiled. Brutus's golden eyes fixed on her, not accusing, but unyielding, demanding truth. Maren tore away, blurting, I'll get help," and fled down the trail, sobbing. "Coward," Verena murmured, quiet but audible to Brutus, who growled in reply. Leora whispered, broken. You see? She wants me gone. Brutus pressed his head into her arm, steady and warm. Verena crouched with her faint smile, brushing Leora's hair. Don't be so dramatic. Love can be clumsy. Snow hushed heavily around them. Maren ran, guilt clawing her ribs. The sound of Leora's scream replayed in her ears. She wanted Elias, anyone, to see what she could not yet name. Back at the ditch, Leora clung to Brutus. You saved me, she whispered. For the first time in days, she let herself believe survival was possible. The radio crackled. Not dispatch. The GPS ping on Elias's dashboard. Distress signal near the old ranger station. A dead zone. He didn't wait. The truck roared uphill, snow spitting from tires. And in the back seat, Brutus paced, whining, barking low. Elias pressed harder. They reached the ruin, and Brutus leapt down, nose to snow, tracking with purpose. Elias followed, dread gnawing, as wheel marks curved too close to the ravine. God, he breathed. Brutus surged ahead, barking sharp. The trees opened to a clearing, and there she was. Leora slumped in her chair, blanket half off, lips blue. Leora! Elias shouted, sprinting. Brutus pressed against the chair, shielding her from wind, anchoring her on the slope. He barked once, urgently. Elias dropped to his knees, brushing snow from her face. I've got you! I've got you! His voice broke. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, then found Brutus. Her lips shaped a single word. Barely sound. Brutus froze, then pressed his muzzle to her chest, a low whine trembling out. His tail thumped once, deliberate. I'm here. I never left. Elias swallowed hard, vision blurring. He lifted her, fragile as glass. Brutus circled close, guarding every angle. Elias whispered, Hold on, Leora. You're safe. Her hand slipped free of the blanket. Brutus nudged it, and her fingers curled weakly into his fur. For a moment, the world hushed. Storm, forest, breath all stilled, as if an unspoken vow bound them. Then Brutus barked toward the trail. No figures yet, no sound, but he had scented someone. Elias's jaw tightened. He shifted her higher, nodded to the shepherd. Let's go, boy. Brutus guided them back, steady but vigilant. At the truck, Elias laid Leora gently in the back seat, covering her with his jacket. Brutus curled beside her, head on her lap, eyes fixed to her face. She stirred, whispering again, fragile but clear. Brutus. Relief cracked through Elias. Not because she spoke, but because she had named her anchor. Brutus exhaled through his nose, acceptance in the sound. A vow renewed. Elias started the engine. Tires crunched, storm closing in. Brutus gave one last look back at the trail, ears sharp. The reckoning was not over. But for now, his place was here, guarding her, breathing for her, living for her. And as snow swallowed the world, her whisper lingered like a thread of light in the cab. Brutus. The office was silent, save for the faint scratch of pen on paper and the low hum of the overhead light. Snow tapped the window panes in a soft percussion that marked the passing hours. Elias hunched over his desk, shoulders tight, brow furrowed as he wrote. The report sprawled across half a dozen pages already, each line deliberate, each detail weighed before it landed. He'd filed hundreds of incident reports as a ranger, but none felt like this. This wasn't a routine accident for the ledger. This was a fracture, the first sharp edge of something buried that now demanded light. Brutus lay stretched across the floor at his feet, massive head on his paws. With each sigh Elias let slip, the shepherd's ears twitched. Now and then his tail thumped, a steady drum that seemed to say, "I'm here. Keep going." Elias paused and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. He could still feel the weight of Leora in his arms, fragile, trembling, and hear the echo of her voice whispering the dog's name like a lifeline. That memory had stitched itself into him. But memory alone wasn't enough. He drew a steadier breath and returned to the report. Time of incident, 16:47 hours. Location, ravine, north of the abandoned ranger station. Weather, snow, light wind, low visibility. Victim, Leora Hale, 17, wheelchair user. Found displaced, at risk of hypothermia. His pen hovered at the next line. Cause. He could write the simple explanation. Accident, chair lost control, slide into ditch. Neat. Safe. Wrong. The tracks had told a different story. The chair at an unnatural angle, faint scuffle prints where someone had stood behind it. No skid marks from a desperate stop. He'd seen real accidents. This didn't fit their shape. He wrote carefully, the words heavy as iron once they existed. Anomalies present. Wheelchair trajectory inconsistent with standard accident. Evidence of external force. Possible push. Requires further inquiry. Brutus lifted his head, ears pricked at the shift in the room. Elias glanced down and managed a thin smile. "You'd back me, wouldn't you, boy?" A soft woof. The dog settled again, eyes never leaving him. Elias documented the rest. Brutus's tracking, the urgency of his behavior, the way the dog had shielded Leora until help arrived. He emphasized the shepherd's role. It wasn't sentiment. It was fact. Brutus had been critical to the girl's survival. He leaned back. The narrative stared up at him, stark and uncompromising. A stack of forms waited at the corner of the desk, chain of custody, follow-up, witness statements. Each would carry this suspicion forward until it could no longer be ignored. The radio hissed once, a burp of static, then stilled. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. Not until the ink dried. He opened his laptop and pulled the GPS logs. The station ping was clear and precise. He clipped the time and coordinates to the file. Evidence, not instinct. A little further down he found it. A 3-minute window where the signal wavered. Not lost, just weakened, as if something interfered. Out there, cell towers meant nothing, but the ranger net was usually clean. Unless someone wanted it otherwise. He flagged the anomaly. The clock ticked past midnight. Elias massaged the tight cords in his neck and exhaled. An investigation wasn't optional now. It was owed to Leora, to the truth, to whatever fragile order held Granite Hollow together. He also knew what it invited. Scrutiny, pushback, shadows pressing back against the light. He clipped the pages into a folder marked Pending Review. The label looked sterile. The weight behind it wasn't. Brutus rose and sat, gaze fixed on him, waiting for the next move. "We've started it," Elias said. "No turning back." Brutus tilted his head, then padded over and set his muzzle on Elias's thigh. Warmth spread from the simple contact, steadier than any policy manual. Elias's fingers sank into coarse fur. He thought of Dr. Hale's quiet worry. of Maran's flinches, of Verena's polished calm. He thought of Lyora, whispering the dog's name. Outside, snow thickened, blanketing the town in deceptive stillness. Inside, the fuse had been lit. He killed the lamp. Brutus fell into step beside him as they left the office, the report waiting on the desk like a quiet line drawn across a map. The clinic was hushed under the late hour, the storm muffling the world. Lamps cast soft pools across the exam room where Lyora lay bundled beneath blankets. The blue in her skin had faded. Warmth was returning by degrees. Her breathing had smoothed from ragged to fragile and steady. Miriam sat beside her, fingers curled around the girl's hand. Every so often she brushed her thumb across Lyora's knuckles, as if reminding herself this was real, here, alive, not a shadow slipping away. Brutus rested on the floor a few feet away, head angled toward the bed, a sentinel at ease, but ready. Miriam had never been a person who sought comfort in animals. Tonight, the shepherd's steady presence loosened something inside her she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wind rattled faintly at the windows. Miriam's gaze drifted there and then farther, across years, to a house that no longer stood, to when Lyora's father was alive. Samuel had been a man of habits, steady, quiet, meticulous, an engineer who brought his precision home. Late nights at the kitchen table, soldering iron in hand, bent over circuit boards, building what he called closed loops. Cameras wired to independent storage, not to catch danger, he'd said, but to keep danger from erasing truth. Miriam's breath caught. The phrase sharpened like a glint through snow, not letting it erase the truth. "Lyora," she whispered, knowing the girl hovered in that grey place between waking and sleep. "Your father. He was always preparing." Across the room, Elias looked up from his notes. He had given Miriam space, but something in her tone shifted the air. "What is it?" She hesitated, feeling the shape of the memory. Years ago, before he passed, Samuel set up a security system. Closed loop, independent. Couldn't be tampered with or wiped remotely. He was stubborn like that. Elias straightened. His pen stilled. "You think it's still active?" "The house burned," Miriam said. "But he kept backups. Always. If one link failed, another would hold. He told me, if anyone ever doubts what happened in these walls, the house will speak for itself." Her voice faltered and then steadied. If Verena, or anyone, was near that path, if a camera was in range, maybe there's still something. A record. A fragment. Hope lit like a small flame. Elias turned the idea in his mind the way he would a map. Routes, distances, cover. Evidence, pure visual, could cut cleanly through neat lies, turn whispers into testimony. "Where?" he asked. "He had caches," Miriam said. "In the old ranger station, I think. He called it a relay point. Right wiring. Less interference from the cliffs." At the station, Brutus's ears twitched. He lifted his head, watching Miriam. Elias leaned forward. "Miriam, are you saying there could be backup footage from the day of the incident? Of the push?" The word hung between them. Miriam flinched, then nodded. "I can't be certain. It's been years. But Samuel rarely trusted chance. If the system was running, it might have caught something." Elias felt the surge of relief and caged it with discipline. "If it exists, we'll find it." "She deserves that," Miriam said, tightening her hold on Leora's hand. Not just to survive, to be seen. He built those systems for her. For moments like this. Silence settled. Heavy, but no longer hopeless. Snow feathered the windows. Inside, the room recalibrated around purpose. Brutus rose and pressed lightly against Miriam's chair. She laid her free hand in his fur. He knew, she murmured, to the dog or to herself. Samuel always seemed to know what storms might come. Brutus gave a quiet woof. Elias closed his folder with deliberate care. The investigation was no longer his alone. The dead had left their fingerprints. The living remembered where to look. Rest, Miriam whispered to her daughter. The truth is still out there. We'll find it for you. For the first time since the fall, her words carried not just sorrow, but conviction. The hallway outside hummed softly under pale lights. Word of Leora's rescue had already rippled through the handful of people gathered in the storm-pressed clinic, each whisper circling like wind. Verena arrived among them with her coat cinched tight and snow glistening in her hair. She timed her entrance with an instinct for attention, the moment when every head would lift. Her gaze swept the waiting area and found Elias. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, voice steady, touched with alarm. Is she going to be all right?" Elias studied her the way he studied weather. In the mountains, you felt the storm before you saw it. The pressure change, the silence in the trees, snow falling in patterns that weren't quite right. Verena carried that same warning. "She's alive," he said, clipped. "Thank God." Her hand rose to her chest. A practiced tremor ran through the words. Clara, standing off to the side, saw the tiny mistiming, the breath placed after the line, not before. An actress remembering cues. Miriam pushed up from her chair, pale and exhausted. "Alive, yes. Barely. She nearly froze." Verena turned toward the gravity in Miriam's voice. "Miriam, I'm so—" A calibrated pause. "So sorry. I was just down the trail. I didn't know she was in danger." Clara's gaze sharpened. She made a living noticing the small things. Twitch of an eyelid, angle of a shoulder. In Verena's face, there was no raw fear, no shock. Only calculation, light skimming off glass. "You were down the trail?" Elias asked evenly. "Yes." Quick nod. "They wanted some air. I didn't want to intrude. I walked ahead. By the time I realized, a hand to the throat. It was too late. Too precise, Clara thought. People in sudden tragedy didn't lay their words so neatly. Silence gathered, heavy as snow on branches. Brutus shifted, ears forward, gaze fixed on Verena. Miriam's fingers interlaced, trembling. "She's a child," Miriam said, voice frayed. "She trusted you." Verena's eyes softened perfectly on cue. "I know, and I would never." The crack came exactly where a listener might expect. She lowered her head just long enough to reset. Elias let the moment stretch. He'd met liars in the forest, poachers who swore they were only hiking, loggers who somehow missed the line. The truth rarely sat in the words. It lived in the spaces around them. Verena's spaces were too tidy. Clara's voice, mild but deliberate, cut in. "Funny," she said. "From the ridge, you can see almost everything by the ravine. Hard to miss someone in trouble. Unless you weren't really looking." Irritation flashed through Verena before the mask slid back. "It was snowing heavily," she replied. "Visibility was poor." "Was it?" Clara tilted her head. "Strange. When I came in, the air was clear." The air in the hall tightened. Miriam's breath hitched. Elias stepped closer, voice low. "If you were just down the trail, you'll remember where, exactly. Show me tomorrow." A blink, then the poised nod of someone forced into agreement. Of course, anything to help. Clara saw it again, the eyes, a split-second flare of something raw. Not fear for Liora, fear of exposure. She pocketed the observation. Timing mattered. Truth should be uncovered, not shouted. Verena moved toward Miriam, hand hovering as if to comfort, never quite touching. "She'll need rest," she said softly. "I'll pray for her." Miriam stiffened, too drained to resist. She nodded. As Verena turned to go, Clara whispered, soft enough for only one man and one dog to hear. "She's acting." Elias met her eyes. The words fit too neatly into what the tracks had already told him, and what ink had already dared to say. Brutus rumbled, a low, steady sound that felt like agreement. "I'll come by tomorrow," Verena said at the door, her face arranged in careful lines of sorrow. "Anything you need, Miriam. Anything at all." The door clicked shut. The performance ended. The hallway reclaimed its hush. Clara crossed her arms and exhaled. "She's covering something. I don't know what yet." Elias nodded once. "Then we find the cracks." Brutus stayed where he was, gaze pinned on the closed door long after Verena's footsteps faded, ears trained to the silence she left behind. Outside, snow kept falling, silent, relentless, ready to bury whatever falsehood lingered too long. Inside, a shepherd watched the door and did not blink. The Ray house sat at the edge of Granite Hollow, like a shell abandoned by life. Shingles sagged, paint peeled, windows dulled with neglect. Elias parked his truck at the foot of the drive. Brutus leapt down beside him, paws crunching into the brittle crust of snow. For a moment, Elias only stared. He had passed this house countless times in his years as a ranger, but tonight, after what had happened to Liora, it felt less like a relic than a wound. The porch groaned beneath his boots. Brutus sniffed, ears swiveling, body alert but calm, as though sensing the ghosts here were of memory rather than threat. Elias pushed the door. It opened easily, as if waiting. Inside, the air hung heavy with dust and something metallic, like rust. His flashlight caught fragments of a life once lived, a child's boots by the door, a single stiff jacket on the rack, faded drawings taped to the refrigerator, stick figures, a dog, a house with smoke curling from its chimney. Elias's throat tightened. He had seen scenes like this overseas, houses abandoned in haste, always whispering the same question. What tore them away? Brutus padded close, tail low. Elias's beam swept over the living room, a toy truck on its side, a coffee cup fossilized on the table, silence stretched over halted lives. Then he found the basement door, slightly ajar. A draft of cold air breathed through. They descended. The cement walls were streaked with damp, shelves lined with expired tins. In the far corner stood a steel locker, nearly 6 feet tall, rust creeping across its seams. A heavy padlock hung on the latch. Brutus circled once and sat directly before it, ears forward, gaze fixed. He gave a low chuff, insistent, not alarmed. Elias crouched. The padlock was old, symbolic as much as secure. Someone had wanted this sealed. Dust rose into the flashlight's beam, like restless spirits. "Samuel," Elias whispered, though he wasn't sure why. The man's presence lingered in the house. A workbench cluttered with cracked lanterns and old tools stood nearby. One hook on the pegboard marked by a clean outline where something once hung. Brutus pawed the floor near the locker. Elias pulled at the padlock. It groaned as if it wanted to open, but he left it. Not tonight. He would need tools, privacy, time. Upstairs, he paused again at the drawings on the fridge. Crayon suns, crooked letters, fragile paper that had outlived the hands that made them. He brushed the edge of one and felt it crinkle, still holding. Memory itself. Snowflakes swirled as he stepped outside. The Ray house wasn't just abandoned. It was a vault. And tomorrow, he will break it open. The next morning, he returned with bolt cutters and a crowbar. Brutus's nails tapped down the basement stairs, each step punctuated by the storm still echoing in Elias's mind. The locker loomed, no longer inert. He braced the cutters against the padlock. One decisive squeeze. Metal cracked, echoing off cement. Hinges screeched as the door opened. Mostly empty shelves. A coil of rope, a tarp, rusted tins. But on the middle shelf, a small metal case wrapped in cloth. Elias lifted it, heavier than expected, and carried it to the workbench. Inside lay a portable hard drive and a stack of labeled discs, dates scrawled in Samuel Ray's blocky hand. His pulse quickened. Miriam had said Samuel kept closed-loop backups. This had to be them. He carried the case upstairs to the dusty study. Miraculously, the old computer still groaned to life. He slid in a disk dated 6 weeks ago. The footage flickered. A grainy view of the staircase where Leora had fallen. Silence. Then, movement. Leora appeared, bundled in her jacket. Verena followed. Close. Too close. Elias leaned forward, breath taut. At first, Verena looked casual, but then her hand extended, not guiding, pushing. A small, deliberate shove. Leora pitched forward, vanishing from frame. No scream, no thud. Just the merciless gaze of the camera, as Verena stood a moment longer, watching. Then, the flicker of her mouth, not shock, but something practiced. Elias's chest hollowed. Brutus growled low, stiff with recognition. Elias froze the frame, zoomed until Verena's hand pressed clear against Leora's back. Intent carved into grayscale pixels. This was no accident. This was betrayal. He replayed it once, twice. Each time the silence was more damning. He thought of Verena as he had known her, quick-witted, teasing, but never imagined cruelty this precise. Now the evidence seared itself into him. Brutus pressed his chin against Elias's knee, grounding him. Elias slipped the disc into a sleeve, then loaded another. Days of mundane life flickered by. Samuel had recorded everything. Perhaps he had suspected betrayal long before. Snow thickened outside. Inside, Elias felt the truth settle like stone. He slipped the disc into his jacket, hand resting on it like a weapon. Come on, Brutus. We've seen enough. They left the Ray house with the case under his arm, silence crunching beneath their boots. The question was no longer what happened to Leora. It was what to do with the truth. Back at his cabin, the storm pressed against the windows, rattling the glass like a living thing. The disc lay on the desk, heavy as a loaded weapon. Elias hovered over the keyboard, knowing that once he acted, there would be no undoing. Brutus paced the floor, nails clicking, restless as the storm itself. Elias slid the disc in again. The staircase appeared. The push replayed. He whispered, "God help us." voice cracking in the lamplight. He pulled 3 blank drives from a drawer, labeled with tape. He began the transfer. Progress bars crawled across the screen. Brutus stilled, ears pricked, watching every motion as if urging him on. 1 drive finished. Elias placed it in a fireproof box. The second went into his jacket pocket. The third, he decided, would go to Clara. She had suspected. She deserved to see. Wind roared louder outside, branches scraping the roof. Brutus barked once, sharp, unsettled. Elias's heart hammered. He knew why. The evidence would unleash not just justice, but a storm inside Granite Hollow. When the final transfer completed, he tucked 1 drive beneath the floorboards. Hidden, known only to him and Brutus. Redundancy, Samuel's lesson. The lamp flickered, shadows swallowing the cabin. Elias felt the weight of choice settle deep. No turning back. He reached for Brutus, resting a hand on the shepherd's head. Steady warmth, unwavering eyes. We're in this together. Whatever storm comes, we face it side by side. Brutus leaned in, silent vow. Elias shut down the computer. The cabin darkened, filled only with the storm's clawing breath and Brutus's steady presence. He gathered his coat, the envelope sealed in his pocket. Tomorrow, Clara will know the truth, and Verena would no longer be able to hide. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and unhesitating. Elias had been at the window, watching snow blur the tree line, when Brutus growled, warning him a heartbeat before the sound. The shepherd stiffened, hackles raised, body angled toward the door. Whoever was outside had come through the storm with purpose. Elias unlatched the lock, hesitating at the handle. When he opened the door, wind swept snow into the cabin, along with Detective Mark Sullivan. Broad-shouldered, frost clinging to his coat, Sullivan carried the weariness of a man built by lies. His gray eyes swept the lamplight, the desk, the sealed envelope. They lingered on Brutus, planted like a sentinel between Elias and the stranger. "You said it couldn't wait," Sullivan murmured. Elias nodded. "You'll see why." The detective crouched briefly, hand extended, but didn't push when Brutus ignored it. "Smart dog." Elias said nothing. He pulled a drive from the fireproof box, setting it on the desk. Sullivan's eyes sharpened. "What am I looking at?" "Proof," Elias said. "Sit down." The footage filled the screen. The staircase, shadows stretching. Lyora moving upward. Verena behind her. The push. The fall. Silence. The room thickened. Sullivan leaned forward, asked to see it again, then again. His jaw worked, his face drawn taut. No matter how many times, the footage remained merciless in its simplicity. At last he stepped back, breath hissing. "Christ almighty." "Clean recording," Elias said. "Closed-loop system. Samuel Ray didn't trust the department." Sullivan paced once, then halted by the window, his reflection hollowed by the knowledge. "Verena, the town bends to her. And now—" He broke off. Silence filled the rest. When he turned back, his face was stone. "We move tonight." Elias blinked. "Tonight?" "The longer it sits, the greater the chance it disappears. Verena has allies. Someone helped bury this once. If word leaks, the evidence vanishes, and so do you. We won't wait." Brutus barked once, sharp, as if sealing the decision. Elias's chest tightened, but resolve steadied him. "All right. Tonight." Sullivan slid the drive into his coat, careful as though handling a weapon. "Then God help us all." Snow muffled every sound as they crossed the drifts. Brutus ranged a step ahead, dusted white, muscles taut. The Ray estate loomed, its gables black against pale night, a single wing lit. Verena moved behind those curtains. "Keep low," Sullivan whispered. 2 deputies followed, chosen for loyalty. Their breath fogged the air. Brutus halted, nose lifted, ears pricked. Elias crouched beside him. "He's got her." Through the window, Verena's silhouette paced, phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, her agitation showed, jerking gestures, sharp turns, scarf slipping. The polished mask was gone. Sullivan studied her, then gave the signal. The deputies cut across the snow, boots crunching. Sullivan and Elias followed, Brutus at their heels. Sullivan's knock rattled the door. "Verena Ray, open the door. Now." Curtains twitched. Verena froze, then cracked the door. Her face was composed, but fear flickered in her eyes. "Detective, this is highly irregular." "Step aside." She hesitated. Brutus barked once, loud, commanding. She flinched and opened wide. The deputies entered, clearing the hall. Sullivan followed, presence heavy as law. Elias came last. Brutus pressed tight to his leg. "What is the meaning of this?" Verena snapped, pacing, phone still clutched. "You'll regret this." Sullivan set the drive on the table. "We saw the video." The words hit like gunfire. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. Denial flickered, fury followed. Elias watched her unravel, dangerous even in collapse. "Verena Ray," Sullivan said, voice unyielding. "You are under arrest for the murder of Leora Ray, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal evidence." The deputies moved. Brutus growled, vibrating the floorboards. Verena laughed sharply. "Murder? You're insane." Her gaze cut to Elias, venom burning. "You think you found the truth? You've unleashed a storm you can't survive." "Save it for the courtroom," Sullivan said. The cuffs closed around her wrists. She resisted, then sagged, breath quick and uneven. "You fools," she hissed. "This won't end with me. You're digging your own graves." The deputies led her out. Snow swallowed her fury. Elias lingered, eyes drawn to the staircase where it had all begun. Brutus nudged his hand, grounding him. Outside, Verena was pushed into the patrol car, cuffs glinting under the moonlight. Sullivan stood on the porch, coat powdered with snow. "It's only the beginning," he said. "But tonight, we did what had to be done." Brutus growled low, memorizing her scent for battles yet to come. For the first time in years, Elias felt a fragile flicker of hope. The storm raged still as Elias guided the truck through buried roads. Brutus sat alert, nose pressed to glass, tail twitching. At last, Miriam's cottage appeared beneath the pines, roof heavy with snow, a single amber light glowing. Elias's chest tightened. Here, amid shadows and betrayal, a fragile piece of innocence still lived. Warmth wrapped him as he entered. Miriam waited, hands folded before her apron, worry etched deep into her face. "They've been asking for you," she whispered. Before he could answer, 2 small figures darted forward. Leora and Maren flung themselves into Brutus's fur, arms wrapped tight, faces buried in his coat. The shepherd stood steady, tail wagging slow, deliberate, as though he knew the sacredness of their trust. Elias swallowed hard. Watching them with him was like watching a dam break. Fear and silence spilling into tears. "He kept us safe," Marin whispered. Brutus nuzzled her, licking away tears. Elias knelt beside them, rough hands settling gently on their shoulders. "You're safe now," he said. "It's over. She can't hurt you anymore." Leora lifted her face, eyes searching. "Are you sure?" The question pierced deep. It wasn't just about Verena. It was about the world, about trust. Elias forced himself to meet her gaze. "I'm sure. I won't let it happen again." Miriam's hand trembled against his arm. "They've been braver than any child should have to be." Elias nodded, but words failed. Brutus's eyes caught his steady, unyielding, "This is why we fight." Elias set the drive on the table. The metal clinked softly. "This isn't just evidence. It's a promise." Miriam's lips pressed tight. "And to yourself." Leora leaned into Brutus, eyes closing. Marin clutched his paw as if anchoring herself. "They'll have to testify, won't they?" Miriam asked. "Maybe not," Elias said. "The video is strong enough, but their story matters, if they're ready." He crouched again, voice soft. "Girls, you've been stronger than most men I know. But now things are changing. You don't have to be afraid anymore." "What if they don't believe us?" Leora whispered. "They will," Elias promised. "Because I believe you. Brutus would never stand by a lie." Marin nodded, solemn. Elias leaned forward, his forehead pressing briefly to Brutus's. The shepherd closed his eyes, silent agreement. "We're ready," Elias said at last, his words carrying to the storm outside as much as to the children. "Whatever comes next, we're ready." For the first time in weeks, Leora smiled faintly. The fire crackled. Snow pressed against the windows, but inside Miriam's cottage, warmth held against the cold, resilience, truth, and the unyielding loyalty of a dog who had already carried too much of the world's darkness. Elias rose, shoulders squared. The fight ahead would be merciless, but he no longer faced it alone. He had Brutus, he had children, and above all, he had the truth. The courthouse smelled of old wood and polish, the scent of history clinging to every bench. Stained glass filtered pale winter light into muted hues across rows of tense faces. The whole county seemed to be holding its breath. At the bench, Judge Holloway sat with grave composure, his gavel resting lightly against worn oak. He had seen too much human frailty to be surprised anymore, but even his eyes betrayed unease. Elias sat at the prosecution's table, shoulders square, jaw tight. At his feet, Brutus lay silent, ears twitching at every shift in the room. Behind them, Miriam held the children close. When the bailiff called the case, silence deepened. Verena entered in shackles, chin lifted in brittle defiance. Her eyes found Elias, lips curling in a poisonous smile. The trial's rhythm began, motions, exhibits, measured voices. But when the prosecutor rolled a monitor forward, the atmosphere sharpened. The lights dimmed. The footage flickered alive. The staircase appeared on screen. Leora climbed carefully. Verena followed, calm, deliberate. No chaos, no warning. Just a hand on a child's back, and a shove. Leora pitched forward, arms flailing, vanishing from frame. Verena stood a moment longer, her expression colder than any scream, then walked away. The screen went black. The silence that followed was unbearable. Brutus lifted his head, growling low until Elias stilled him with a hand. Judge Holloway's voice, usually firm, came softer. "The record will note the evidence." The prosecutor turned. "The state is called Leora Hartman." Gasps rippled through the benches. Miriam clutched her hand, but the girl rose, pale and trembling. As she passed Brutus, her fingers brushed his ear, drawing courage. She climbed into the witness chair, feet not reaching the floor. The prosecutor crouched to her level. "Leora, can you tell us what happened that day?" Her hands gripped the chair. For a moment she faltered, then her eyes hardened with something fierce. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut the air clean. "I was pushed." The words hung like a blade. Judge Holloway tapped his gavel once, sealing them into record. At the defense table, Verina's mask cracked, her lips curled, eyes flashing feral. But Leora didn't flinch. She held the woman's gaze. "She wanted me gone." The defense attorney's half-hearted questions, could she have slipped, misunderstood, crumbled under the video's weight. Leora's truth held. When she stepped down, legs shaking, she bypassed Miriam and went straight to Brutus, burying her face in his fur. The shepherd stood steady, his warmth absorbing tremors her small body couldn't contain. Elias closed his eyes. The trial wasn't over, but the truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be unmade. The morning of sentencing carried a different silence. Not tense, not expectant, just heavy, as if the building itself braced for an ending. The benches were half full now, the curious gone, the wounded remaining. Elias rested a hand unconsciously on Brutus's thick coat. Behind him, Miriam sat with Marin and Leora in plain sweaters, hair neatly combed, faces pale but resolute. They were not hidden anymore. They were here to be seen. Judge Holloway entered, robes flowing, his eyes softening when they fell on the children. "Bring the defendant forward." Verena rose, shackles clinking faintly. Her chin was high, her face carved from ice. The judge reviewed the charges: attempted murder, endangerment, obstruction. His voice carried steady as an iron bell. "The evidence leaves no doubt. This court finds you guilty on all counts." No one stirred. The verdict had been inevitable. "Verena Holloway," he said, "for your crimes, you are sentenced to 28 years in the custody of the state. No parole for the first 20. A murmur rippled, then stilled. For the first time, Verena faltered. Her lips parted, eyes narrowing as though she'd misheard. But she did not plead. She stood rigid as the gavel fell, sealing her fate. As the bailiff moved to escort her, she turned her head, gaze sweeping over Elias, Miriam, and finally the children. It was not hatred she carried, nor remorse, only emptiness. The look of someone stripped of every illusion. Her voice slipped out, hoarse. "You don't know what you've done." But the words dissolved like smoke. The heavy door shut, and she was gone. For a long moment, the room stayed still. Then a collective exhale, like a county, remembering how to breathe. Elias turned. Marin and Leora sat frozen, hands gripping the bench. Then Marin's fingers crept sideways. Leora found them. They stayed linked, fragile but unbreakable. Miriam drew them in, tears shining. Brutus rose, stepping close. The children leaned into him, his thick fur taking the weight of tears neither wanted to show. Judge Holloway gathered his notes, but paused. His voice, softer now, lingered. "Let it be known, this court has witnessed courage, and courage deserves to be remembered." When he left, silence remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was space, for healing to begin. That afternoon, in the courthouse conference room, the future was laid out in folders stamped with the county seal. Brutus stretched near the door, chin on paws, tail flicking once. He knew instinctively this was not a room for noise. At the head of the table sat Tessa Rowe, the social worker who had followed the case from the start. Her grey blazer was softened by a scarf, her eyes carrying the tired compassion of someone who bore others' heartbreak for a living. Miriam sat beside Elias, knuckles pale where her hands clasped. The children leaned into her, Maren's eyes darting nervously, Leora's pressed tight to her side. Tessa cleared her throat gently. "We've reviewed the testimony, the evidence, the assessments. Both children have said, in their own words, they feel safest with you, Elias, and with you, Miriam. The court has approved the petition for guardianship." The words landed like a dawn. Leora's breath caught. She turned up to Miriam, whispering, "We don't have to leave?" Miriam's composure cracked. She wrapped her arms tighter. "No, sweetheart. You're staying. With us." Maren's reaction was quieter. His shoulders sagged, the burden slipping at last. His hand found Leora's, fingers knotting. This time, not from fear, but from relief. Elias swallowed hard. He had faced gunfire, betrayal, loss. Yet this moment left a lump in his throat. "That's right," he managed. "Whatever it takes." Tessa smiled faintly. "I don't doubt it. And it seems they already have a guardian of their own in him." She nodded at Brutus, who had risen, ears perked. The children slid from their chairs, wrapping their arms around the shepherd's neck. He stood steady, tail wagging slow and deliberate, promising silently he was theirs. "Sign here," Tessa said gently. Pens scratched across paper. Each stroke carried more weight than any rifle Elias had ever held. When the last signature was done, the room seemed to exhale. Miriam brushed a tear from her cheek. Elias steadied her with an arm across the back of her chair. Together they looked at the children, still clinging to Brutus. It wasn't over. No, it was beginning. "You've given them something no system can replicate," Tessa said at the door. "Stability. A family." When she left, silence lingered, not heavy, but expansive, filled with possibility. Elias crouched, meeting the children at eye level. Brutus stood between them, the bridge that had carried them all across the storm. "You're safe now," Elias said softly. "That's not just words. That's a promise." Maren searched his face, cautious. "You won't send us away?" Elias shook his head. "Not now. Not ever." Leora's fingers tightened on his. "Then we can call this home?" Something scarred inside Elias shifted at her question. He looked at Miriam, at Brutus, at the two children bound by survival and love. "Yes," he said, voice breaking with truth heavier than any oath. "This is home." The children pressed close. Brutus circled them like a sentry, tail sweeping the floor. Miriam leaned into Elias, tears slipping, not of grief, but release. For the first time in too long, the word family felt whole. Shadows would never vanish entirely, but the light in that room was enough to carry them forward. Together. The snow was softening, melting into rivulets that traced the edges of Elias's land. Winter was loosening its grip, and with it came the quiet work of turning survival into living. Elias stood on the porch, not of a solitary cabin anymore, but of a house slowly reshaped into a home. Brutus sprawled at his feet, nose twitching at scents of thawing earth. Beyond the porch stretched the projects that had filled Elias's days since the trial ended. The ramp was the first. Steps that once seemed harmless now looked like a wall to a girl who sometimes walked hesitantly. He smoothed the slats himself, calloused palms brushing the grain. When Leora first climbed it, she'd paused halfway, looked back with a shy grin, and whispered, "It feels like you built this just for me." And the truth was, he had. Beside the ramp, Miriam and Leora planted herbs, thyme, mint, rosemary. The girl crouched low, pressing seedlings into soil with quiet reverence. "This is mine," she said, patting the earth as though sealing a secret. Elias only nodded, throat tight. She had a place now. Inside, Maren had claimed a corner by the wall. A small table, stacks of paper, jars of pencils. His drawings spread across the room. Wolves in the forest, Brutus tilting his head, even Elias himself, rendered stronger than he felt. The boy rarely spoke, but sometimes he hummed while sketching, and that faint sound felt like healing. Everywhere carried their traces, boots too small for Elias by the door, Miriam's knitting basket by the fire, Brutus stretched where the children were, instead of on his blanket. That morning, the shepherd had found himself in the town square. Deputies, townsfolk, even the mayor had gathered. From a podium, the mayor held up a medal. "Today we honor bravery, not of a man, but of a companion who stood where danger struck. Brutus Ward." The ribbon looked absurd against thick fur, but the crowd cheered. Brutus blinked, tail still. Only when Elias produced the real reward, a jar of peanut butter, did his tail thump wildly, tongue diving in as laughter rippled across the square. On the walk back, Maren carried the medal reverently. "He's a hero," he whispered. Elias corrected softly. "He's family." That evening the sky burned amber. Miriam hummed in the kitchen. Leora knelt by her sprouting mint. Maren sketched Brutus lazing in the grass. Watching them, Elias felt warmth settle in his chest. He wasn't just building a house anymore. He was building a home. Weeks later, in a rehabilitation clinic, smelling faintly of antiseptic and pine oil, Leora stood between parallel bars, small hands gripping the rails. She had balked at first, frightened, but now determination flickered in her eyes. Miriam waited close. Elias sat watchful on the bench. Brutus lay tethered lightly at Elias's wrist, ears twitching, gaze fixed on the girl. Dogs knew when moments mattered. "Whenever you're ready," the therapist said. Leora drew in a breath, lifted one trembling foot, and set it down. The bars quivered under her grip, but she held. A second step, then a third, each halting, uneven, but forward. Miriam's hand covered her mouth, tears slipping freely. Elias clenched his fists, heart hammering. At the end of the rail, sweat streaking her brow, Leora looked past the therapist, toward them. Her lips curved into a small, proud smile. "I walked," she whispered. "Yes," Elias said, voice thick. "You did." Brutus thumped his tail once, holding his applause until the finish. When Miriam swept Leora into her arms, Elias turned away, jaw tight. He had seen victories on battlefields, but none as triumphant as this. Outside, under a cedar tree, Maren crouched over paper, fingers smudged with paint. Brutus nosed at the page as the boy glanced up. His drawing showed Brutus beneath the towering cedar, ears sharp, eyes alive. At the bottom, one word: safe. Miriam laughed through fresh tears. Elias crouched beside the boy. "That's good work." "It's him," Marin murmured, pride flickering in his eyes. "How he looks when he knows we're okay." Elias nodded slowly. The boy had captured it exactly. The way Brutus was more than muscle and fur. He was an anchor, guardian, and promise. That afternoon, Elias carried the painting home under his arm. Leora slept against Miriam's shoulder, exhausted but radiant. Brutus trotted close, medal still swinging from his neck, oblivious to its meaning. At the cabin, Elias hung Marin's drawing above the hearth. It joined others, but at the center, Brutus beneath the cedar, sentinel of their safety. Evenings grew quieter with spring. One night, the fire glowed low, shadows shifting on the walls. Leora sat curled in a quilt, notebook balanced on her knees. Her handwriting wavered, but her concentration was fierce. Across the rug, Marin sketched Brutus, firelight caught in amber eyes. Elias sat in his chair, boots unlaced, watching. He'd learned miracles weren't explosions of light, but quiet things, steps taken, pages written. At last, Leora closed her notebook, clutching it. "I want to read it," she whispered. Marin set down his pencil. Miriam, carrying Coco, stilled in the doorway. Even Brutus lifted his head. Elias leaned forward. "Go ahead." Her voice was halting but clear. The day I wasn't alone. I thought the snow would take me. I thought no one would find me. But I wasn't alone. A dog came first. He was warm. He stayed. Then a man came. He lifted me. I wasn't alone anymore." Her breath hitched, but she finished. "Sometimes a miracle isn't big. Sometimes it's just someone not leaving." Silence followed, thick with love and gratitude. Miriam set the mugs aside and pulled both children close. Brutus rose, pressing his head onto Leora's lap, steady and grounding. Elias sat back, eyes stinging. That was it. That was the whole story. Later, after the children slept, Elias stepped onto the porch. The night was sharp and cold. Stars scattered like embers across the sky. Through the window he saw Brutus curled at the foot of the children's bed, loyal as ever. The cedar trees whispered in the wind. Elias breathed deep, words from Leora's notebook echoing inside him. The day I wasn't alone. Sometimes, miracles didn't come as grand rescues. Sometimes they came as smaller things, a quiet man who refused to walk away, a dog who stayed, children who found courage to speak the truth. In that little house beneath Silverpine's trees, those miracles had taken root. The snow would fall again, scars would remain, but there would be laughter too, and drawings on walls, and mint sprouting in the garden. And through it all, they would not be alone. Elias stood a while longer beneath the stars, then turned inside, where warmth waited. Brutus stirred, ears flicking, eyes opening just long enough to track him across the room. Elias laid a hand on the shepherd's head, whispering the word that now belonged to all of them. Home. Sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones about triumphs or grand victories, but the ones that remind us of loyalty, the kind that sits quietly beside you when you're hurting, or stands guard when the world feels uncertain. German shepherds, with their steady eyes and steadfast hearts, seem to carry that truth better than most. They remind us that love doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's in the weight of a head resting on your knee, or a bark that comes just in time. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt that bond, the kind that feels like family, you already know how much these connections shape us. And if you'd like to deepen that bond, there are some wonderful resources out there that share ways to strengthen trust and communication with your own dog. I found one recently that I think you'd really enjoy. It's gentle, practical, and filled with heart. Take a look when you feel like it. Think of it not as advice, but as a friend, sharing something that made life a little better. Your dog, in their quiet loyalty, deserves that gift.